Thank you very much for being here. Let me introduce you very briefly. Fabien Roques, you are Executive VP at Compass LEXECON and head of the EMEA energy practice based between Paris and Brussels. With over 20 years experience, you're leading expert on regulatory competition and commercial issue across the energy sector, and you are also teaching at the Florence School of Regulation and Paris Dauphine University. So you will be in conversation with Stephane Dubos. You are industry banker and co-head of the low carbon energy group at NATIXIS CIB. The floor is yours to start with.
Thank you, Christina. Hello to all, welcome to all, and of course, thank you to Fabien for accepting our invitation. So indeed, grid, it's widely accepted today that grid is a key bottleneck in the energy transition of our power system. We've been observing underinvestments in many countries for several years, or at least an investment that was not significant enough to cope with the significant renewables growth in terms of what is now increasingly measured as a clean to grid investment ratio or grid to clean investment ratio. So with your help, Fabien, we will try to understand how power grid can cope with that massive investment needs, how as well they could evolve from generally perceived very rigid and centralized systems towards more agile grid systems in response to energy transition, and also how regulation could help to reach that agility and as well to attract more private investment in that asset class. But maybe as a first question, and because we have just following the Spanish blackout panel, I'd be curious to hear about your reaction about the preceding panels in the first place.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to share some views. What I take away from the previous panel is this interesting contrast between the US and Europe when it comes to innovation and how to manage the grid. I think the key takeaway is that we need more innovation in the grid. We need smart technologies to be deployed there, and we need the regulatory framework to evolve so that we can do that in Europe. I'll come back to that in a minute.
And so let's start by Europe in the first place. I guess, could you give us a brief fresh or description of where investment needs stands in the European landscapes for TSOs and DSOs?
Yes, and I have a slide on that. Very concretely, to give you some figures. We've talked about planning. So if you look at the investment plans, you have heard, like me, that the European Commission is saying that we need 730 billions in the distribution grid by 2040. So in the next 15 years, 730. And in the transport sector, 480 billion. Now, these are big figures, but to give you a sense, this is doubling or tripling the historical rate of investment in the sector. So that's the first thing I can tell you. Now, this is planning. Let's look at what the transport system operators are doing. And we've done a bit of a benchmark, and you see the results here on the slide. Very concretely, big differences between the different transport system operators in their plans for spending. What is behind? Well, very concretely, different types of investments. Essentially, some grids are weaker than others. There's already a lot of congestion, for instance, in Germany. There's lots of congestion in the UK, meaning the grid needs to be quickly upgraded, and that leads to massive investments. Then another source of difference, I would say, is the role of offshore wind. In some of these countries, you have big spending on the grid to do at the transport level to connect offshore wind, particularly in the North Sea. And if you look at essentially Belgium, Germany, Denmark, which is not on the slide, but also the Netherlands, a good part of the investments are also offshore, and we'll come back to that.
And what could be, in view of those massive investment plans, do we already identify some bottlenecks, basically? Possibly in terms of supply chain. there is, to a certain extent, as well a link to critical materials for that infrastructure. Where do you identify the key bottlenecks or the key factors to achieve those investments and be successful?
Well, clearly, all of what you said is relevant. You know, planning, permitting, and the delays. This is definitely an issue. Supply chains, yes, but I would say a lot of the transmission and distribution system operators are now grouping themselves and defining strategies to have advanced purchasing of critical materials and equipment on the supply chain. So they are reacting and anticipating. I think the real bottleneck is the lack of a supportive regulatory and market design.
Yeah, no, I guess that was as well a key remark of the previous panel, but that's coming to regulation. I guess most of us are very familiar with the fact that grid operators or grid infrastructure benefits from a well-known RAB-based regulation. But I mean, it's a system that is very often criticized as not adequate enough in our energy transition context. And I recall, I mean, several presentations or exchanges where that RAB-based system as of today is considered as not incentivizing enough transition investments, maybe anticipating transition better. I guess it's RAB is in relation to what is invested, but to which extent the system could anticipate or anticipatory investments and could answer to that. And maybe a system that probably does not give enough room for innovation and efficiency as well. In terms of, I mean, let's not forget as well that in many countries, grids are the first electro-intensive industry in terms of power losses, and still today above many other electricity industry and also AI or data centers. So curious to hear about your views on how regulation could evolve and where we stand today.
Before I address your question, let me step back just a little bit. How regulation could evolve, I think you mentioned two key words. The first one is anticipation. The other one is innovation. So let me say just a little bit more on that slide. Why do we need to be better at anticipating our needs? I think the previous panel was quite clear that a lot of things could have been done in advance of these blackouts happening. Very concretely, you see on that slide, on the left, the different planning mechanisms that we have in Europe in the electricity sector. So we have a planning mechanism, I think it's been mentioned, for the network. It's called the TYNDP, the 10-year Network Development Plan. Every transmission system operator has to design a 10-year forward plan for its grid. But on top of that, we've got a plan for adequacy, meaning ensuring that we've got enough supply to meet demand. On top of that, we've overlaid a requirement that we anticipate the flexibility needs. So that's another plan. And finally, we've got different scenarios done by different countries. What is the issue? Well, a lot of this is not connected. A lot of this is lacking a comprehensive framework to anticipate the system needs. So I call that system needs. I think Aaron earlier mentioned the attributes of the power system. So we need to get a lot better at understanding in Europe what do we need going forward in the system. So that's your point on anticipation.
Okay. And yeah.
I have another one, if you allow me to carry on, which is innovation. So on innovation, I have another slide. Very concretely, I think we need to be smarter with our grids. We have a range of what I call grid-enhancing technologies. What are grid-enhancing technologies? Well, there are many. I think we've discussed storage, of course, but there are other things. Advanced conductors, dynamic line rating, high-temperature superconductors, grid inertia measurement. All of these technologies have the potential to help the grid do its job a lot better if they are deployed at scale and quickly enough. And the beauty is that these technologies are commercially mature, for the vast majority, and can be deployed much quicker, much faster than new lines. So all you need is a regulatory framework that will foster innovation and force, to some extent, or provide incentives to the grid operators to embrace these technologies.
and possibly have a less probably passive behavior in terms of that transition and investment needs. Do you have live examples at the moment of what is being discussed in terms of regulatory adjustments at a European scale level, typically, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are actually having this conference at a very timely moment. Some of you may be aware that there is a big legislative text in preparation in Brussels, which is called the Grids Package. So there is a legislative package that's going to be published on the 10th of December. That's the latest I heard. And it's going to be a set of new regulations that are supposed to provide the framework to accelerate the grid build-out in Europe and also support these kind of things that I mentioned, meaning more innovation in the grid. Now, very concretely, what does that mean? Well, it means also potentially the way to attract private third-party capital. And that's something that I find very relevant in the context, I have a slide, particularly of offshore wind. This is essentially showing you the North Sea. And what you see with these bubbles is offshore wind being developed. Now, a lot of these wind farms will need to be connected not just to the different countries, but between themselves as well. So we have to build, in the next 10 years, a massive infrastructure in the North Sea. Now, the challenge here is that this requires coordination between countries, and this requires new regulations that's not existing to allocate cost and benefits and make this an investable asset class. So it's about creating literally a new asset class with new regulation.
Okay. I guess coming back to our previous points on bottlenecks, I guess, and impact of those massive investments going forward towards end users, because someone would have to pay. Do you think those huge investments would necessarily translate at some time into significant increases for end users' bill? What are your views on the measures that could be helpful in that respect?
So I think you touch on the fundamental question of who pays for the grid build-out, but more fundamentally for the energy transition. I think the simple message is that we are now entering into the truth moment for the energy transition. We have to make the hard choices about who pays. Now, in connection to the grid, what does that mean? Well, it means, first question, do we want, as a one-for-one, the increase in investment in the grid to lead to an increase in the tariff that we are paying as customers? Well, maybe there are ways to have third-party financing in. That's the first thing to say. And I think the grid package that's going to come in Europe will provide the basis for a lot more private investment in the grid alongside some of the transmission and distribution operators. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we need regulatory structures that allow a décalage between the moment you invest and the moment you pay. And we are working together with a number of countries and regulators on these new regulatory frameworks that support that décalage, so that it's not just an immediate one-for-one increase in the tariff at the moment when you increase the spending in the grid. And the last thing is that there's going to be also fundamentally a challenge for the grid operators themselves. I have a slide on that, and you see that the different transmission system operators are themselves innovating in the way they plan to finance these investments. So in some countries, it comes with a greater role for the state. If you look at the Netherlands or Germany, there's been some renationalization of some of the transport operators. In some of the other countries, there's been an increase in capital. There's been disposals of some non-critical assets to support the financing. Reduction in dividends payout, that's been rare, but it had happened in a couple of countries, in the UK and Switzerland. Green bonds have been mentioned, and finally, I already mentioned it, but I think this is one of the key leeways, private investment in grids.
No, and we've seen live example on recent German grid operators or subsidiaries in Germany of European operators attracting successfully private investment in a JV format. Maybe because it was addressed as well. I mean, we've been talking about grid and But another key aspect is in relation, and the offshore island was interesting, but interconnectors. And I think we're late in the European context in terms of reaching the European objective of interconnection capacity. Regarding new interconnectors, we've sometimes seen a certain reluctance, but country by country basis, because the very purpose of connecting to power market is obviously a certain price convergence, but that purpose can sometimes be the key drawback as well, because I guess you have the low power cost countries probably reluctant to see a convergence which may come at their detriment. So in that respect, do you anticipate it's an asset class as well, where we will see going forward regulatory changes to foster further interconnection on our grids?
I'd say yes, and there is actually, at this very moment, a summit of the energy ministers of the North Sea. So they've been meeting yesterday and today, and you will see in the news that a number of announcements will be made on how they collaborate together to provide a platform for regulation and financing innovation. We've been working with a number of TSOs. So one of the papers that's being released today is from the Belgium TSO, Elia, and it calls for a new financing framework for offshore wind and the grid. And I have a slide on that, and very concretely, what is the idea? The idea is that you would create a separate SPV, and that PV could mutualize different interconnectors assets in the North grid. So you would be having different transmission operators having a role to operate that SPV, which could be financed by third-party investors. Obviously, there is a role for equity and debt there, with guarantees from the different governments involved in the North Sea. So when I was mentioning a new asset class, this is what I was referring to. There is an entire paper and study that's backed up by several governments in the North Sea that is released today. And there is a hope that the EU Action Plan for Grids, in 1 month when it's published, will build on these developments.
Okay, interesting. No, it's true that we bankers or investors, I guess, on this asset class specifically, we sometimes struggle with respect to bankability of the merchant component. So if I hear you well, governments start to acknowledge that and probably would be ready to offer some kind of guarantee or at least asset mutualization.
That's exactly the idea we've been working on, and for those of you interested, please get in touch, because we've done a lot of work on this issue to make it bankable. And fundamentally, you need to address the risk that you have an uncertain development of the grid, and that will drive the revenues of your assets. So there is a big risk that is hard to model, a lot harder than when you just look at one asset, a wind farm. So you need to mutualize, you need to have state guarantees, and that is fundamentally the idea of this new investment vehicles, that you would pool different projects together so that they would hedge themselves, and you would add to that government guarantees.
Hedge themselves, you mean in terms of offsetting the respective remuneration from one asset to the other?
Exactly, because the idea is if you build one line, but assuming that another line is going to be built in the same time, and that line is not built, that changes completely the remuneration of the first line. So what you want is to pool the risks by grouping the different projects so that they have a common fate. They are developed or not, but at the same time, so that you ensure the bankability.
Okay. So would this be the kind of secret recipe against cannibalization that you're describing? No?
No, it's not going to be a secret recipe, but we hope, with others working on these new financing structures, that this can be a stepping stone to building a new asset class and to unleash massive investment, both equity and debt, in these types of assets.
Okay. And it's true that in terms of interconnectors, again, we've seen in the market TSOs but also private developers increasingly active in that field. So you estimate that this would help further situations where private developers can develop that infrastructure asset class.
Absolutely. I want to loop that back to what you have discussed, what we have discussed earlier. We've seen there is a big role for data centers. Well, I work a lot with these hyperscalers to help them secure access to energy. The top issue is actually not energy, it's access to the grid. And fundamentally what they tell me, and I work with them, is we need innovation in the regulatory framework so that we can invest together with the grid operators. So there is actually appetite from the industrial off-takers themselves to be part of that grid build-out if the conditions allow them to come in.
Okay. And without falling into too much technicity, if I recall properly, getting private on interconnectors required some form of exemption from the European Commission. And I guess we've not seen many being awarded exemptions to privately contract, basically, your capacity to other counterparts in particular. Do you think this may change going forward in view of the needs for further infrastructure?
Yes, and I tend to be a bit more optimistic than you. I have personally worked on more than 15 interconnection projects on the financing and regulatory side, so this is happening. Now, obviously, we need to upscale that massively, and I think it is the idea that you would streamline. You know, you need something that is scalable, fundamentally. The problem with the exemption process is that each project is unique. So it's very good for people like me, because then you need a consultant to do the due diligence each time. But if you want to be able to scale up and have more appetite, both on the equity side, on the debt side, you need to massify some of these things and streamline. And I think this is the approach of the Commission. It's to move away from the exemption approach to defining conditions which would apply across assets, which would have these common features. So you define almost a new asset class.
Okay. Maybe.
Great applause, please. Thank you very much to both of you. Do we have questions in the room? Any questions? Well, I think it was crystal clear. If you have anything else to add?
Maybe linking a point to not the previous panel, but the ones of the afternoon. AI, again, because it was the motto of the Infra Week, apparently. What could be the potential for AI on that grid optimization and infra?
I think it's already happening. You know, working with grid operators, they are bringing AI to automatize and streamline a lot of their grid processes. So clearly it's part of this bigger picture on digitalization of the grid. We haven't talked much about it, but this is one big part of some of the investments you see. It's the digitalization part.
Thank you very much. A great applause, please, again. Thank you.